This is NEGOTIATEx podcast, show number 110. Hello, welcome to the NEGOTIATEx podcast. My name is Nolan Martin. Joined with me today is my partner, Aaron Denisian. Aaron, you want to kick this one off?
I sure will. Thanks, Nolan. Dr. Susan Rains is a diplomat for the U.S. State Department, currently serving in Mexico. Her views that she'll share today are her own and not a statement of the State Department. Now, for 2 decades, Susan served as professor and program director for the Conflict Management and Peacebuilding Graduate Program at Kennesaw State University, which just happens to also be my wife's alma mater. Susan is a mediator. Yeah, round of applause. Yeah. Yay for your Kennesaw. The Owls. Susan is a mediator and conflict resolution consultant for multinational and international organizations with a focus on dispute prevention and resolution through superior management and leadership capacity building. Her textbook, Conflict Management for Managers and Leaders, is used to train managers, leaders, and ombudsmen to prevent and manage conflict effectively to enhance mission achievement. She co-authored Expert Mediators for advanced mediators and negotiators, using data gathered from the most experienced mediators in the world. Susan served as the editor-in-chief for Conflict Resolution Quarterly for 12 years and has authored more than 60 peer-reviewed articles. She has mediated more than 18,000 cases inside and outside of the court system. Did I get that number right? 18,000?
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of business there.
That's a lot of work. 18,000 cases inside and outside of the court system, trained mediators worldwide, and coached executive leadership teams for Fortune 500 organizations. She has lived in 6 states and 5 countries and has worked in or visited more than 60 additional countries. Susan loves to hike, paddle, run, travel, read, cook, bake, and spend time with her family and friends, although I have no idea how you find the time to do all that, Susan, and still find the time to be with us today. Thanks so much for joining us on the NEGOTIATEx podcast.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for that rather long introduction.
Well, it's great to cover everything you do, including all the hobbies.
You know what Jimmy Carter was famous to say? It's amazing how much you can cram into 100 years.
Isn't that true? And as we record this, obviously tomorrow is our National Day of Mourning for former President Carter. So very much in the forefront of our thinking, particularly with the work that he did diplomatically too.
Yes. Amazing.
Well, Susan, you had quite a career in conflict management. I got to ask you, was this always the plan where you saw yourself, or did something happen? What caused you to get into this line of work?
You know, I grew up as a hippie kid in California. Well, I grew up in it, and I wanted to pursue world peace, make the world a better place. You know, can't we all just get along? And it turns out that the way you pursue world peace is just thousands and thousands of negotiations and efforts to conflict and make decisions on a daily, monthly basis. Everything from when I started, I did international environmental treaty negotiation. Then I did interstate water issues, right? And then everything from divorces and how we get along in our families to our communities, international child abduction mediation, right? For custody disputes. So really bringing peace to the world starts with bringing peace to our world and resolving those conflicts through negotiation and conflict management in the home, in the community, in the workplace, and then internationally. So I like to work in all of those different realms and to pursue world peace.
Boy, I love that quote. Let me make sure I got it right. Bringing peace to the world starts with bringing peace to our own worlds. Did I get that?
Yeah,
that's
sure.
I like that is good. I like that. And I'll tell you, that is just in line with what Nolan and I are trying to do with NEGOTIATEx and highlighting the work of you and so many others that are in the field and really working complex, hard problems.
Yeah. You know, there's a joke that conflict management, conflict resolution is a growth industry because once you learn how to spot it, you know, people who say, you know, that they don't have opportunities to practice their negotiation skills, I say, oh, yes, you do. Do you have a teenager? You know, absolutely. There's no shortage. Do you have a nosy neighbor? You know, there's no shortage of opportunities to practice our negotiation skills at work and everywhere.
Yeah, they don't seem to be going away anytime soon.
No.
So Susan, we'd love to start by discussing your book and academic career. Why'd you focus on managers? You know, as we sit here in early 2025, do managers need conflict management skills now more than ever before? Or is this something that they've been needing more of, but just haven't received?
Yeah, I think we maybe didn't label it this way, but all managers are conflict managers, right? You become a manager not just because you're good at whatever technical skill you started out as. Maybe you were an engineer and now you're managing engineers, or maybe you were a physician and now you're an administrator at the hospital, right? Or a dean at the university. But once you're in that managerial position, very little of your job has to do with that expertise that got you there. Now your job is managing people and resolving problems. And we know that conflict avoidant managers almost never rise above middle management, sometimes low middle management, because it is their job to be proactive, to sometimes take risks, to pull together a team that's not functioning well and really dig into that and pull out that splinter and figure out, how do we get that fixed. So all managers are conflict managers. I think we're now recognizing this as a skill set that we kind of thought some people were naturally good at and some people were naturally bad at. But it turns out everybody can get pretty good at this, right? It really is a set of skills and processes. So you learn the steps of a process and you practice the skills. And those things can really be helpful for all managers. And even when I have a manager who's conflict avoidant or just thinks they're not good, they don't have good people skills, I tell them you tackle it like you tackle any other thing. If you need to learn how to do budgeting, you take some budgeting class or you learn how to budget. It's the same thing. These are skills that anybody can learn to improve.
On this topic of skills, what do you think are the most critical conflict management skills that a new or seasoned manager needs to master?
I think the first, and there's this thing called recency bias. So whatever we're currently dealing with just pops to mind. But I do think that when you have really nice people, really nice managers, really nice people on the team, they are sometimes afraid to have difficult conversations because they're worried about hurting the relationship, and they end up hurting the relationship because they refuse to have, those hard conversations. So the number one skill for managers is to not be afraid to have difficult conversations. That's actually all the research indicates. It is these really hard conversations that brings us together and builds our ability to function well as a team. And conflict comes from unmet expectations, right? That's one of my mantras. Conflict comes from unmet expectations. So maybe you thought it was going to go this way, or the project would be done a certain way, or that we were going to communicate a certain way, but we didn't discuss it explicitly. We didn't reach agreements about it explicitly. And now there's conflicts because I assume you should just know what I have in my head, and you assume the same. And we end up making it personal and thinking you're not doing it right. So the number one skill for managers is that willingness to roll up their sleeves and sit down. And it's almost, and I hate to use a word in business that people probably don't want to hear, but it's almost like a fear of intimacy. It's like I'm afraid to really tell you that I'm upset about something, or I'm afraid to tell you that this is bothering me. But if I don't tell you, right, we're going to have volcano syndrome. People just blow up because they can't take it anymore, right? That number one skill is the willingness to engage in hard conversations. And you do that by letting people know that we're all on the same team. And I really want you to succeed. I want to succeed together. So let's put our heads together and figure it out. So that number one skill for sure is that willingness to engage, fearlessness.
I love that. I don't think that's something we always hear. And yet it is very common sense, right? That willingness to step in.
Yeah. And you kind of mentioned that, conflict often gets this bad rep, whether in business or elsewhere. But as you say in your book, conflict isn't inherently negative. It's about how we handle it. Does conflict and how we handle it look different in public versus private versus nonprofit sectors, or are the nuances between these fairly small?
I give a couple of metaphors are helpful. Conflict is like air. It's all around us, and it can be polluted or it can be clean, right? Or it's like a garden, and it's going to grow weeds or it's going to grow flowers. So how are we tending that? It's going to be there whether we handle it or not. So the question is how we handle it makes it positive or negative. How we tend our garden makes it grow weeds or it makes it grow fruit and flowers. So just assume conflict is there, and then building those skills and the comfort level to manage it really, really matter. And then public, private sector, the only thing I would say is that small organizations and younger organizations move faster, respond quicker, and they don't have all these layers of bureaucracy, so that if you want to try a new program or make a change or pivot, you can do that a lot faster than in a really big organization. And sometimes in a big organization, you actually have to go through a bunch of layers just to get permission to engage in a negotiation, not to mention permission about what your parameters are, what's the most or least you can agree to, for example. The big thing I see is that older, more bureaucratic organizations, whether they're public or private, are at a disadvantage in an environment that's rapidly changing and in an environment where innovation matters. But public agencies are meant to not make really snap decisions. We're meant to really do everything with transparency and have committees that make the idea that more minds on this is going to yield a better result. So there's pros and cons to that, but we definitely need to think about all these, what I call multi-level games, right? So a 2-level game means I have to negotiate with my team and get us all on the same page before I can negotiate with the other side, right? With the other negotiating partner. I don't like to see them as opposition. But sometimes it takes a lot in a big organization, a bureaucratic organization or a public organization, to get the team on that same page so that you can then go and engage. in that external negotiation. So we always think about, we miss those internal negotiations that have to happen first so we can get everybody behind the fact that a change is needed or that we're ready to go ahead and engage in some kind of negotiation. I think that's harder the bigger the organization and the older it gets.
Yeah, I find that interesting because, Nolan, you and I, we often will talk about the greater difficulties or challenges with internal negotiations. And I don't know if I thought that it's possibly more of an issue for a more mature business than maybe for a younger developing company.
What advice would you have for a leader that identifies that their personnel are either willing to kind of address the conflict? You as a leader understand that you do need to address the conflict, but you don't know how well it's going to be received or how well they're going to engage with what you're trying to talk to them about or just get on the table. Is that something that leaders should be able to identify as when timing's right or situation or scenario? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think part of it is what we call communicating intent before content. Intent before content means if I'm going to have a conversation that I think might be difficult, whether it's a performance review, whether it's coming up with a new idea that I want us to consider pursuing, or I want to get rid of an idea that I think is pretty bad that we've been pursuing, that's even harder. So intent before content is when I would say to someone, hey, I don't know if this is going to work, but I wonder, my goal is, whatever it is, my goal is for us to not miss this opportunity. Something's happening we can take advantage of right now. Or my goal is to fill in the blank, right? So intent before content sets out that positive intent so that someone doesn't think, here's Susan making more work for me. Right. Susan doesn't care that I'm really invested in this other project and now she wants me to do this. Or if I'm thinking about my boss, that kind of thing. So intent before content, it allows the person who's communicating the need or the change to kind of set that positive tone and then just say, I want to hear your thoughts and ideas. Let's put our heads together and figure out, what's next, if anything. Right? Like what should we pursue or not? So that intent before content, I think, is really helpful for managers that want to get their team on board. And then I think it is, if you're willing to actually take into concern or take into consideration the needs and thoughts or ideas of your team to go, and it's, of course, more complex the problem, the more different perspectives we need to solve it. So you want to make sure that you're getting that input. And the worst thing is when someone says an idea, but the culture of the organization is so toxic that there's 10 people around the table who know you tried that idea 5 years ago or whatever, and it was a horrible failure. Or, you have thoughts, but you don't share it because you don't feel like your views are valued or your expertise is going to be listened to, or you don't fit in or whatever. You're too new, whatever it is. And then the whole organization actually misses out the opportunity from that input. So managers really have to be aware that they have blind spots they can't see. None of us can see our own stuff, our own blind spots. Yeah. Other people can see them. And so we want to invite people to point out to us, what could I be missing? This is the concept of having someone in your cabinet, if you're president, for example, one or more people from the other party, having advisors that are from all different walks of life because they're going to notice things you don't notice, right? So we really want to, as a manager, communicate that we're super open to all that feedback. And our intent is, for example, not to make your job harder, give you more work, but instead figure out how to do it better.
And that's a nice lead into talking about organizational culture, which was something that you tackled in your book. And my hat's off to anybody who wants to tackle discussing organizational culture, because that is the worst thing I've ever had to deal with in my professional life. And I would love never to have to deal with an organizational culture change again. But I know that's probably not a choice I get. You talk about the challenges when you try to change culture. In your experiences, Susan, what do the best organizations, how do they train, empower managers, and then help them effectively lead organizational change when they're trying to build a more healthy culture?
I say certainly leaders, and a crisis provokes change. And I typically get called in to organizations that have experienced a scandal or a crisis, or proactive organizations that say we're at a point where we think we really could make a change and a positive change in our culture or whatever, or we want to make sure we continue to have good culture. But a lot of times they wait till there's been a crisis or a scandal. And that is a great opportunity to make big change because you can't pretend anymore that you don't need it, that there's nothing wrong. And people from outside an organization can look at it, can understand a culture and see it because many of the elements of that culture become invisible to people who are in it for a while. Like, how do we talk to each other? What is said or unsaid? What is the process for decision making? Who holds the real power? Do we actually live our mission, or do we just give it lip service and do these other things? All of these things that are kind of the unwritten HR manual that everybody knows we do it this way, but we don't put it in writing. Or we have it in writing, but we don't really follow it. All of those things you don't know when you're brand new in an organization. So leaders and managers need to constantly be tending that garden of organizational culture. They need to be measuring it, first of all, through very simple surveys that can, like, would you recommend this as a place to work? Would you recommend your team as a place to work? If you were able to work with your manager again because he got promoted to another unit, would you want to follow that manager to that new unit, for example? Very simple questions that give us a feel about organizational culture. So you have to measure it and know what it is, because otherwise we're kind of oblivious sometimes. And then it's not just people at the top, it's every one of us. Because in my unit of, let's say, 5 people that I see every day, I impact the culture in that organization and in my unit, even if I'm not the leader. So don't wait. This concept that, my prince will come and someday rescue my organizational culture. Our hero is going to come and fix this place. I've had people say that for 15, 20 years. That's a very long wait, right? So you make your organizational culture change every day. And if you want to make a change by going into your team and saying, hey, what if we huddle up and just talk about what are the ways in which we could communicate that would work for everybody? Or what is working? What could be done better? And you go around the room and you talk about that. And then you reach agreements on what you're going to try to innovate and change in that area. That affects culture. And then those active bystander kind of activities. If someone is saying or doing something that you find inappropriate, if someone says, oh, sign my time card even though I really wasn't here last week, or whatever it is, inappropriate comments they're saying about a particular group, anything that, you can use humor, you can redirect people. But to just say, ouch, that thing you just said kind of struck, a nerve. Could we maybe, talk about that? But those are ways that we affect organizational culture every day. And it really is the unit that you're in every day that affects whether or not you're happy in an organization. So if you're in a big organization, like the Department of Defense or a university, if your team is really good, like mine was, really, really good, even if the bigger organization is having ups and downs and has they have good leaders, bad years, they have bad leaders. But your daily work is pretty insulated because you've got a great team that supports each other and works great and has a great culture. And at a minimum, we should all strive for impacting the culture in our immediate team, as well as trying to impact the organization more broadly. But leaders also, they have to invite that information about the culture and figure out what's working and not working. And this is my other mantra: behavior continues as long as it is working. So if you are a colleague or a supervisor or a manager and you see someone's behavior that's inappropriate and you don't do anything about it, or worse, you reward it, then you've just made sure that organization is going to continue to be going down a bad path. So we have to be willing to, in lots of ways, make bad behavior stop working.
Which is easier said than done when the bad behavior is really rooted deeply in an organization.
I got a metaphor for you. I have a friend. I do dog training because I do people training, and it's all the same thing.
I agree.
You can come over here. I got my dogs.
So I have a friend whose dog will literally came to my house for dinner and brought her dog, and her dog will literally put its face in your lap while you're eating to try to get food from you. Literally put its face in your lap while you're eating. And she says, oh, I'm going to make up the name, protect the innocent. She says, okay, Fido, please, don't beg at the table. And then she gives Fido a piece of bacon. Okay. Not that there was bacon at my table, but whatever there was, she gives Fido. I don't want to reveal too much. So again, what is Fido going to do? Fido's going to beg at the table, right? If you've got a 28-year-old who's playing video games in your basement and isn't in grad school, isn't, getting a job, there's a real easy way to fix that, right? We just say, this isn't because it's a punishment. It's because there's growth opportunities out there, and you're going to find them because you're going to need to, right? But we need our words and our actions to be in alignment. So if I say the meeting starts at 9 and I'm leading the meeting, I will start talking at 9. Because if I wait till 9:05, everybody who was there on time thinks, okay, well, now the meeting starts at 9:05. Next time I'm going to be late. And the late people come even later, right? So we can't reward behavior unless we want that behavior to continue. And that's true with our kids. That's true with everybody in our workplace. And it's not mean at all. People don't even see it that way typically.
Now, how do we engage our middle level managers, right? Because I face this a few times throughout my career where I'm the bad guy. I'm the only one that's going around and correcting everybody. But there's plenty of leaders between me and that individual. How do I engage them to get them kind of on the same train as me?
Oof, wow, that's a good one. Well, so I generally, having been a leader, I've been a follower, I've been a mid-level manager, I've been a high-level manager. So I've had all those perspectives. And I think it's important that individuals not receive direction from multiple bosses, right? Because this boss tells you go do it this way, this boss tells you the other way, and you're in a no-win situation. So I don't ever direct someone else's employee, typically, other than kind of setting healthy boundaries about how I'm treated. For example, if you email me at midnight and you want an immediate response, I don't care who you are, I'm not going to reward the behavior if the agreement is we don't do that, right? I will email you back at 8:05 or whatever, right? So, but I won't directly direct someone else's employee. What I'll do is I'll talk to that person's supervisor and say, hey, there's something, I just want to bring it to your attention. No harm, no foul if you decide not to pursue it, but I wanted to raise this concern and get your thoughts about it. I think that's okay to do because, again, if they decide not to do it, then you have that issue of how bad is the behavior and is it impacting you and your team? And then in my team, I definitely create that culture where we trust each other. We can have hard conversations. We know we all mess up, right? Somebody tells a joke and it's a little bit on the edge, it doesn't mean that you're coming down like a box of rocks. You're just, if folks are uncomfortable, they need to all feel able to say something, right? That's the rule in that team, for example. So we have to figure those things out in our team and then have those kind of delicate conversations, but don't be afraid to have them. And I do think if you do it to say, like, I'm on your, again, intent before content. Hey, Bob, I really want to make sure this thing I've noticed doesn't kind of escalate. I'm wondering if I could bring it to your attention and then put it in your capable hands. Whatever you choose to do is fine, right? And sometimes people need to hear something from more than one person before they believe it's true, because denial is the most powerful force in the universe. Stronger than gravity, stronger than love. Denial, when you're trying to take the keys away from grandpa, denial is so strong. So sometimes I remind myself, it's okay if Bob heard this one thing from me and didn't do anything, because what's going to happen is Bob's going to hear it from 3 or 4 other people, and eventually Bob will be like, dang, Susan was right. That 6 months ago, I should nip this in the bud, right? So just, trust the fact that you don't control the outcome. You just control your part in the process. So I do my part, and then I let it go.
Now, to put Jack on the hot seat, now what do you do if it is an equal peer and their lack of, paying attention to the company culture that everyone is building? It's impacting your team because your team's seeing things that go unnoticed. What advice would you give that leader to talk to their peer?
I think 2 things we have to remember is, as they used to say, it's not Lake Wobegon where all our children are above average. So the reality is you're going to get some great managers and you're going to get some managers that maybe aren't so great. And it's not about experience necessarily, because you get some really bad managers that have been there a long time, and then you get some really good young ones, right? So age is not a factor necessarily. So I think you have to setting healthy boundaries is how we succeed at work. And with our managing up, setting boundaries to help our boss manage us better, and then also with our peers as well. So if something doesn't affect me and my team, I am maybe judicious about deciding which things to just let go and which things to say something about. If something affects me and my team, then it's my job to try to affect it and impact it. Now, the broader mission matters a lot too. If I saw somebody doing something, and of course, probably most of us have, if you've seen somebody do something that's just truly counter to the mission and it is just not okay, then you have to decide what's the best way to get that handled. Is it by talking to the person directly? Is it by making an anonymous complaint? Is it by making a not anonymous complaint, right? Then you get strategic. But aside from kind of those really bad things that happen, but remember, that's what I'm called in for, so I see those. We have to create systems where people can be whistleblowers or where people can complain anonymously about things they've seen or done, right, or things that are happening. But aside from those really egregious things, just those everyday things, we have to decide that I don't control everything, and I used to really try really hard, and I was not a happy person. So I pick my battles. Is this something that affects me and my team, the mission that I'm part of? Right. If not, sometimes I just acknowledge the fact that this guy, isn't interested, for example. If they're not introspective, maybe they're not really that interested in being a better manager either. Or they think they're hopeless and helpless, right? That's where depression comes from. When you're hopeless and helpless, there's nothing I can do about this. You might share some information that might counteract that view, but I only push it so far. Yeah.
So much of what you've been discussing, Susan, I feel kind of lands in the realm of what's my mindset. I mean, I love the language you've used. Earlier, you mentioned not calling your counterpart an opponent. That's about mindset. In your book, you talk about cognitive biases that often go unchecked in negotiation. Specifically, you mentioned 7: irrational stubbornness, zero-sum thinking, anchoring framing, sacrificing, the all about me, and overconfidence. Why is it so critical to check one's mindset when it comes to conflict? And do you have any practical tips for doing so, especially when someone is in the moment of negotiating?
Yes, we have this misattribution, right? So attribution error occurs when we attribute someone's behavior. We put a motivation to that behavior that's typically negative, right? Especially if we have no relationship with our negotiation partner, or either no relationship or a negative history of a relationship. We're going to tend to put a negative attribution and say in our head, the reason they're doing this is because fill in the blank. They don't like me. They're vicious. They, whatever. And we tend to go to our very dark places sometimes and assume that our worst fears are someone else's reality. We could engage in projection, for example, something I'm afraid of happening. Now I'm just sure it's happening. And maybe I'm overblowing it, whatever. So I have learned a few things where I'll ask folks, the person that I'm in this, we'll say in a conflict with, for example, I like this framing where I say, the story I'm telling myself is blah, 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 blah. Can you please edit that story and tell me where I've got it wrong? And that seems to be less likely to provoke defensive reactions than to say, hey, buddy, you're being a jerk, knock it off. But I can say, the story I'm telling myself is maybe we have different goals here, or that you really don't like me very much, and as a result, this is happening, or whatever it is. And just check that and say, and again, intent before content. My goal is to make sure that we work together the best we possibly can and we get the most out of this interaction for both of us, right? Because if you're negotiating, you're inherently interdependent. I can't get what I want all by myself, or I wouldn't even be talking to you. I'd go get it. So that means we need to find a way to work well together. The story I'm telling myself, I use that sometimes. I will remind myself, what is my conflict management style out of the 5 main styles? Avoidant, accommodating, collaborative, competitive, and compromising, right? So what is my main style, and is my style affecting this interaction? Because maybe the other person has a style, because each style comes with a language, a body language, all these things, right? So maybe their style is very different than mine. Maybe they're very accommodating or avoiding, and I'm taking that to mean they don't see this as a problem or whatever, right? So I want to think about not personalizing what they're doing. And then sometimes you deal with 10% of the time with, there's a great book called Snakes in Suits, right? Someone who has an actual personality disorder, narcissistic, borderline, antisocial personality disorder, which label sociopaths or psychopaths, all these things, right? If for some reason I'm dealing with someone like that, that I've figured out, like it's all about me, the narcissist, then I'll use that to my advantage in the negotiation, totally pure manipulation. I'll say things, but for good, okay? I'll say things like, you could be the hero here, and make this concession that shows how, generous you are, or whatever. So there's ways to kind of use, if you think you can figure out what that is, there's sometimes ways to use that to your advantage to make sure that you're not getting taken advantage of in the negotiation.
How about when it's obvious to you that your counterpart, is suffering from some strong cognitive biases? Is there a way to reverse that and help them unpack what's going on for them?
Yeah, so I would give that number 1 is denial, where someone thinks something's not a big problem, or they think they can handle it, or they think the way we've been doing things is fine and we can just keep doing it that way, even though the world has completely changed and the problem has changed and the competitors have changed, right? So that denial, with denial, you have to chip it away. You can't rip it away. And the idea there is that the purpose of denial is to protect us psychologically from a reality that is so devastating it could provoke a breakdown. And so the only way to kind of get through that is just like persistent, little by little. It typically doesn't necessarily happen quickly if someone's in a strong amount of denial. And sometimes this is awful, but sometimes you have to let the other person fail a little bit if it's not terminal for the organization and come back. You have an employee or a teenager who's not doing their homework, not preparing for meetings, not meeting deadlines. And sometimes after, you have to be careful because as a leader, it does reflect on you, but in the end, it reflects on them. So you set them up to succeed, but there's also consequences if they don't. And you let them have those consequences. And then eventually those consequences may help get that denial to go away.
I'd love to get your opinion here. And well, first, we mentioned framing here. Could you explain what framing is? The reason or where I'm going with this is we've had a lot of people, other negotiators, and we all understand that everyone negotiates differently. There's times that you would do things and times that you won't. But we even have other, professors or other influencer type people that are talking how hard anchoring is the way to go and you're going to get better outcomes if you do it. And they're going around telling everybody this. I want to get your opinion on this and how does that affect things?
Okay, so I pick up 2 things in what you just asked me. So the first thing is framing is the words and concepts we use to describe what we're seeing. So if there's a problem, the words and the concepts I use to describe it let you know how I see that, or in what my focus is, right? What's within the frame and what's outside of that frame. And so if I frame it to say, gosh, Nolan, I see you've been, coming in late to all the meetings and you need to knock it off and one more meeting and you're out, right? Like, whatever it is, that's a pretty big consequence. versus saying, so that framing is that I clearly frame that problem like I'm the boss and you're the subordinate and I have this power and you don't or something, which of course is just not an accurate view of the situation. If someone's not doing what you want them to do, they do have power, right? So the other framing would be frame that as a joint problem to solve. Hey, we can't get this meeting started on time when everybody isn't here because then we have to back up and repeat ourselves when they get here, or we're missing that data you were going to bring. What can we do to make sure if this meeting time isn't working? Is there another one? Well, let's brainstorm. What do we need to do to fix this problem? Right? How can we fix this problem together? So that framing as a joint problem to solve versus framing it as me telling you what to do, right? So the collaborative approach instead of the competitive approach. And hard anchoring, okay, anybody who tells you there's one right approach to every negotiation is a novice. And I'm going to throw that out there. In our book, Expert Mediators, when we interviewed 206, the world's best negotiators, mediators, multiple interviews, one of my favorite quotes is from somebody from Jersey. And she says, I go into that negotiation and I'll be whoever I need to be. I'll be a judge. I'll be a cheerleader. I'll be your Aunt Sally. I'll be your mama. I'll be whatever you need me to be to get it done, I'm going to get it done, right? So sometimes you might come into a mediation and play a little dumb and be like, oh, I didn't know that, because this makes this person really feel good about themselves and like you, and now they're going to, be more collaborative. So there's just so many things that we can do differently in a negotiation depending upon what it is we're negotiating about, how interdependent we are, how much we think we're going to have a future relationship with that person. Because if I come in just loaded for bear and tell you how it's going to be and I'm not compromising, I may end up driving you away and you're going to go work for my competitor or something else when we could have had a much better outcome. So I would just say, like for the example of being stuck on a hard anchoring position, which is where you throw out the first number in a negotiation and you throw it high or low and then you try to stick to it and get them to come to your number, right? I think that is probably appropriate in some situations, but if you use that every time, you're going to come off like a jerk and nobody's going to want to work with you.
Yeah. I'd say too, you're going to solve for the wrong problem because you didn't fully understand the problem first before you jumped into trying to solve it. That's in your line of work in diplomacy and in stuff that Nolan and I did in the military. That can be incredibly costly in terms of time and resources and trust that just can't get rebuilt. And it's because of this approach that you're talking about.
One thing that makes me think of just real quick is that every time we leave an interaction with someone, whether it's the boss's administrative assistant or it's our boss or a colleague, every time we walk out of the room, we want them to be thinking, wow, I really want to work again with Nolan or Aram. I really want to work with them again because they're great. That's what you want them to be thinking. Not that you want them to like you, because it's not about that. It's that you want that relationship to continue to be mutually beneficial instead of what a pain they are.
And I think that what I tend to see as we start to talk about this, the relationships, everything like that, is it really just kills creativity. Aram, you kind of alluded to, you're not solving the right problem. But then I also find no creative solutions end up coming out of something that I tend to see start like this. And so,
Susan, in your book, you discuss the ever-changing workforce. I mean, we are at a more diverse workforce than at any other time in history. We might say, whether that is diversity around gender, culture, generational differences, or so many other factors around who we are and identity. How would you coach a manager trying to apply the concepts and skills you've discussed and at the same time manage this very diverse workforce that they're trying to oversee?
It's really a competition issue, right? Because you want to get the best and the brightest and hardworking, innovative, competent people working for you. And you want them to come to work as a team. And again, not withhold ideas because they're going to be worried somebody will smack them down or they'll be silenced or whatever. It's not just about equity and fairness. Yes, it is all those things, but those arguments never win the day. Yeah. It's about the bottom line. And I'll give an example. I had an organization that brought me in because they were having a problem hiring and retaining diverse. It was a scientific organization. And they needed engineers and they needed mathematicians and physicists and all these chemists and all these kind of science people. And I'm in a room with 200 people, and they're all different levels of the organization, but these are all college-educated scientists. In the room, there's two women. There's me, and there's a woman who used to be in the military. And that's it. And I asked folks, well, what are your concerns about diversity issues? And someone raised his hand and said, I'm worried that I can't get promoted as a white man anymore. I'm like, okay, well, first of all, this is not the organization that has that problem today, right?
Right.
Yes. But we have to address it, right? One of his colleagues stood up. I couldn't have paid the guy to do this. He did it so well. And he said, we hired this female engineer. We kind of stole her from another company. She came in here. She was here 3 weeks and left. And he said she was, in that 3 weeks, the person everybody went to when they had a problem they couldn't fix on their own. And the reason she said she left is every time she went in to lead a meeting, people said, well, we'll wait till your boss gets here. Wow. And they just over and over, she had this. So the reason why this matters. So what I say to managers is it's not, I know there's a lot of politics and a lot of feelings. People are up in their feelings about all this, all right? And okay, it helps to focus on even just the business of it. I don't care what you look like, where you come from, I want the best person at that job. And by definition, the best person at that job can't only be from one demographic or from one or two, right? It could be who knows, right? And then if you have people from different perspectives, you're going to have people solve problems better. We know that innovative teams and for complex problem solving, the more diversity, and I mean diversity meaning different kind of upbringings, different academic fields, different whatever, right? Different age groups, different generations, all different kinds of people, you're going to have better ability to do that. So we really want to think about that just from the business idea sells itself. And by the way, when we look at organizations where there is greater diversity and we ask, how happy are you in your organization? Even people from traditionally empowered groups are happier in diverse organizations. Why? Because they tend to be organizations that once you're in there, they don't care about what group you come from. They care about what you can contribute. And they tend to treat each other better and just be nicer to each other. And so that is amazing to me to remind folks that it's in your own best interest. Even, I'm a white woman. It's in my own best interest to be in an organization that is open to all kinds of people because it's going to help us do the best job possible and be kinder to each other as human beings and get to know your employees as people, not as members of a group.
So much of that work goes back to what you were talking about earlier, I think, around organizational culture and the daily work of our interactions.
I had a guy named Steve, and he was in a training with me, and he said, one of my coworkers said, Steve, do you want to be called Black or African American? And he said, I want to be called Steve. I don't call you by your race. I just want to be called Steve, and that's kind of it. Let's just get to know people as people. We don't need to take it any deeper than that. It's so simple.
As a slight follow-up to this question, thinking about operating in other countries where you've done a lot of that work, what's your single biggest piece of advice for someone who's preparing to negotiate in a foreign country?
Yeah, so intercultural negotiation, and everything's a negotiation, whether you're at the market or you're at work or you're, driving. So my biggest piece of advice is take a deep breath and know that you're going to be frustrated sometimes. Anticipate failure events, because there's going to be times when you misread the situation and you feel awful or it's embarrassing. So you have to come in with humility and know that you're going to have some missteps as you're learning. And then you have to ask the people around you, build some trusted relationships, like your host family, the people who you feel like can clue you in, especially if they are bicultural, so they know your culture and their culture, or they've worked with people like you before. And you just say, hey, Alma, I don't know that much about this. If I mess up, will you let me know? Or shoot me a look, or we need a code word if I'm getting it wrong, so that folks can do that. I just literally was asked, I redesigned a form at work, and I was asking people to sign the form, and they were signing it. Even I'd circle the X where they sign it, and I would hand it to them, and they would not sign where the circle was. I'm like, what is going on? How much clearer could I make it? And somebody's like, no, if you circle it, it means we don't want it. Oh, well, shoot, I wish somebody had told me that as I'm redesigning this form. So yeah, just anticipate those failure events, be humble, ask for help. And then in the book, but there are certain continua upon which every cultures vary, right? Like independent versus collective. We care more about what's good for the group, or we care what's more about what's good for the individual. Or we like to communicate very directly, or we like to kind of imply things and communicate more indirectly. Think of Georgia versus New York City, right? Bless your heart. Right? Doesn't mean bless your heart. So, learning those things a little bit about the culture you're going into will help you fit in better and understand what's going to be frustrating for you.
Susan, with your over 18,000 cases that you mediated, I'm sure many of those have been as a third-party mediator. I'm sure many of those have been internal. What are some of the things that you can do to really make progress to two parties that may be at an impasse?
So I really walk people through a problem-solving process, and people will say things like, I don't want a mediator, I don't want my boss's help to facilitate this conversation, because if talking was going to resolve it, we'd have had it resolved by now. I'm like, okay, but you're focusing on the outcome. You want this or that. Instead, what you need to do is focus on the steps of a problem-solving process and see where it takes you. And the secret is it mostly will get you, right? But if you jump ahead and you try to say, this is what I demand, or this is what I want, or you just don't know how to walk through those steps. So those steps, very, very simple, right? where person is going to set the table and say, okay, we're each going to go around the room and say what it is we need and why. What is it you want and why, right? I demand X, Y, Z. Why? Tell me more about that. What's that about? Is it about fairness? Is it about you have bills to pay? Is it about your budget restrictions? Is it about whatever, right? Is your boss on your back? Like, what's going on? And then we literally list what all those needs are, and then we brainstorm together the ways we can get those needs met, right? And how we can help each other meet those needs. And if we go through the steps of that process, usually we're going to end up in a good resolution. And for some reason, even as a mediator, what I think it's funny is if a judge or a mediator or an attorney gets divorced, they still benefit usually from going to mediation because you need someone outside the conflict sometimes to help you see things that you can't see or to ask you questions you're trying not to ask yourself, right? Or to walk you through those steps. So that's the key there is walking through the steps of the process and maintaining that process focus.
Now, I know that you've done a ton of training, so I'm sure you've seen what's also detrimental that the mediator can do when he or she's trying to mediate two parties or multiple parties. Can you talk through some of those things that may be detrimental in that case?
It's kind of like a therapist. We don't really talk about ourselves very much, right? So we have to kind of make sure that we're keeping our own stuff out of it to the extent we can. I think it sometimes can be helpful for someone to understand that we've all had conflicts like this. Or if it's, even reasonable to think that can be helpful, but to make sure that our own, like somebody might want something that we think is crazy. Why would you want that? And I need to understand more about why they want that instead of thinking, no, I have a better idea for what you should want or what the outcome should be and putting our own values onto other people. I think the other thing is there's great new research I've been working on. Mediators are terrible at predicting which cases will settle or not settle in like the first 30 to 60 minutes of a long case, right? And they might think, oh, there's no way, just like the parties, there's no way this is going to settle. There's 50 things they're disagreeing on and they hate each other, right? And then if you chip it away, you take one little issue and you work on it, then you take the next one and you work on it. And 7 hours later, you've resolved the whole thing, or 7 days later, or 7 months later, depending on what it is. You've got it all done, right? And you never thought you could have. You can only eat that elephant one bite at a time. We need to be patient and walk through that process and chunk it, break that big issues down into smaller chunks or a big list of issues into smaller chunks. Because otherwise it's so overwhelming, people just can't engage in it. And so I think the problem that mediators and parties have, and maybe bosses even, is that we skip to the end too quickly and say, oh, impasse, like this isn't going to work out, or you just need to be fired or whatever. Instead of walking through the steps of, well, what can we do together? What can we accomplish together?
Yeah, to me, that lands like Nolan's earlier question, which is one of the problems when you throw out, you anchor hard and you throw out a solution early, right, is that you've skipped the process. And there is goodness in the process. Trust the process. Walk through those steps, right? And especially, and I was going to go the same place as you went with the elephant, right? But especially when it is, BHAG of it's just an ugly, something, atrocious that you're trying to come up to. You got to have a good process in place.
Absolutely. There's no other way about it. Sometimes it feels like slow work, but the good thing is as you're making progress and you're breaking down barriers and you're building rapport and you're making small agreements, it gets easier and easier as it goes along. It's hard to get going. I joke that it's kind of having a hard negotiation or a hard mediation is just like going to the gym where nobody wants to work out. Like before the workout, most people don't, unless you're a real nut job, nobody wants to work out really hard. But then when you're done, you think, wow, I'm so glad I did that. And that's exactly how it is. I've never had somebody go through a mediation, even when it didn't reach agreement, and say that they thought it wasn't useful. They all thought it was useful.
All right. Well, we've been talking for a while. So I think we've got you to a point where we can ask you a really hard question finally. Yeah. So given your vast experience, as you reflect on negotiations or situations of conflict you've been part of, or maybe you've advised on, is there one that you view as a failure? And can we ask you what you learned from it?
Yeah. There's probably more than one, I'm sure, but the one that comes to mind that haunts me is so silly. So I used to every year take my graduate students to a conflict area, and we would do a study abroad, right? And my graduate students, they're lawyers and they're doctors and they're cops and they're teachers, all different backgrounds, and they want to manage conflict in their various realms, military. So we're in Jerusalem, and we're in the market in Jerusalem. And I have always wanted to have a beautiful hookah pipe, right? And so we're in the market, and I see these beautiful hookah pipes, and my students are with me, right? Like I got 3 students with me. They're, in groups around the bazaar. And so I just made the number one mistake. I walk up and I start negotiating with the guy, and, halfway through the negotiation, it occurs to me, I have teenagers in my house, and I'm basically buying, but a bong, and I'm going to bring it home in my luggage, which is also not easy. So it occurred to me, I actually don't really want it. And so then I'm like, oh, I changed my mind, and I start walking away, and the guy's like, no, I'll drop my price. He thinks it's a strategy. And then I look like an absolute amateur schmuck in front of my students. And so I explained it. We all laughed. But now I just remind myself, before you go into a negotiation, if you know it's going to be a negotiation, right, you should think ahead of time, what is it that I'm willing to do or not willing to do, knowing that can change with more information.
Right.
Do I really want this or not? Where are my boundaries? What strategies might I try? And then you get in there and it changes as it goes, right? But you at least should go in there with some of those things in your head. What is it worth to me? Yeah. What am I willing to pay for this thing? And then, of course, that can utterly change, but at least have some of those ideas.
Fun example. All right, let's flip the script. Is there a negotiation that you're most proud of? And what was it that you did to negotiate it successfully?
Okay, I think I'll tell you an interesting story, maybe more than I'm proud of this, 50 plus stakeholder, 8-year-long watershed mediation in Georgia. That was the first statewide watershed planning that crossed jurisdictions, and water's a big deal. But the one that I did that I think was funnier and more, maybe more important in some ways, I was called into an international organization that had a history of scandal, just scandal after scandal after scandal. And they wanted myself and a team of other people to make some recommendations about how they not continue to have these problems. So we had to look at what are their current ethics rules and what are their current practices and that kind of thing. So they wanted to, again, show that they're turning a page as an organization. It's a very old organization. They had us interviewed to do a press release. They were getting ready to put the press release out that was going to say, hey, we've hired these really, ethical, knowledgeable people to come in and help us do better in the future, right? And then we said, okay, well, this is the data we want to look at. We want to talk to people who have had complaints. We want to talk to people who have filed lawsuits against you. We want to, whatever it is, right? We want access to all the information about the disputes you're currently having or that you've had recently so that we can really dig into our work. And they're like, no. We just want to do the press release. And, we're not sure you need to see, you don't want to look under the rug and see all that stuff under the rug, And it occurred to myself and my colleagues that we might have been brought in to, for kind of lip service, make it look like the organization wants to change. But there certainly were people in the organization that were sincere in this effort and some that were afraid. So the best negotiation, again, was that internal negotiation about how do we access what we need? How do we make this legitimate? And really, because it won't work otherwise. And it'll hurt our reputation as well as yours, right? The thing I got my team to agree to is call them and tell them to hold the press release. Say, maybe you should announce that we're doing this big project. If the big project means we can't see the data we need to do the big project, like maybe you're going to need to hold that press release. There was already leakage, so people kind of knew there was going to be a press release, and people kind of knew it was coming. So it would be kind of look bad if all of a sudden we're like, hey, we're backing out. We're not touching this with a 10-foot pole, right? That's a little bit, it was risky because it meant that our project could be killed. The takeaway from that, and I hope we all think about that, is use the power you have. We don't have any power in that organization. We're outsiders. We're contractors. They can cancel that contract in a heartbeat, right? But the power we have, we got to use it, whatever that is. Informal power, formal power.
Susan, 2023, you left academia to go into foreign service. May we ask about how you came to that decision and how since then have you been able to apply this in practice and the concepts that you taught in theory?
Yeah, so I was international relations undergrad, and even my PhD from Indiana University is international public policy. And I've always wanted to do this kind of work as a diplomat. Went into academics and loved it, but kind of because my oldest child was born with cerebral palsy and couldn't be dragged around the world. My first post was, I started this process and was going into this State Department when I was in my late 20s. And I couldn't bring a child to Central Africa without great health care and move her around all the time. So I decided to take this other career track. And it went well. I love, things happen for a reason, right? It's been a lovely journey. And I've had an opportunity to still travel and see the world and do great things, but have a home base. When my youngest child, that child is now married and independent and happy and healthy. And when my youngest child said, Mom, I think I want to go to college in Europe. And I said, well, if you're not staying, I'm not staying. I just said, I empty nested and I took, God bless, a pay cut and said, I had this dream and I kind of always wondered what that would have been like. And I'm at the point where I can afford to find out. So I decided I wanted to I just trust that the skills I've built will be useful here. And I wanted to serve. I had worked for FEMA in the summers a little bit. I just wanted to have that experience of serving and being of use to my country, which sounds, I know, it's probably not politically popular to say anymore.
It's not a cliche with us for sure. So we greatly appreciate that sentiment. Well, and one of my favorite quotes is by the author George Eliot, who wrote, "You're never too late to be what you might have been."
There you go.
Yeah, I love it. And I love your path. What a cool thing.
You don't want to be wondering, what if, right? Let's find out.
Well, as we prepare to wrap up, Susan, what final thought would you leave with the listeners who are seeking to elevate their influence through purposeful negotiation?
My number one request or suggestion is recognize the negotiations you're having every day, because people think about Mideast peace process, or they think about big trade negotiations, or even maybe negotiating a raise with their boss. But we are having negotiations every day, and it gives you this laboratory that you can use to practice some of the ideas and skills you're hearing on the podcast, things you're reading. So use that lab, and remember that conflict avoidance is going to keep you from succeeding. Lean into uncomfortable conversations and just have faith that this is going to work out better for everybody. If you enter that conversation with goodwill and you communicate that goodwill, that conversation is going to elevate that relationship and get you what you need in that negotiation. So recognize your negotiations and then enter them bravely.
Beautifully said. Susan, thanks so much for joining us today. We know you're very busy and this was not easy to set up. So thank you for making time in your schedule to be with us. We're deeply grateful.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for your flexibility.
We wish you the very best in your continued service.
Thank you.
Well, that is it for us on today's podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the NEGOTIATEx podcast if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next episode.